and welcome to WooStream, bringing Willamette to you. My name is Paul McKean. I'm Assistant Director of Engagement Communications at Willamette. And in just a second, I will turn it over to our distinguished panelists. But today's conversation is being led by Seth Kotler, Professor of History and hosted by the Bay Area Regional Chapter and Chapter Volunteer Leader Joe Gruber, Class of 2009. Special thanks to Joe and the Bay Area chapter for their awesome work putting this event together. And of course, thanks to Professor Kotler for being here as well. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Joe.
Good evening, and thank you all for attending. And thank you, Professor Kotler, for giving up your evening to chat with us about Hamilton. Professor Seth Kotler has been with Willamette University's history department since 2000. His academic focus, thankfully for tonight, is United States history in the years after the American Revolution leading up to the Civil War. Professor Kotler's past courses include the abolition of slavery, the American Revolution, the history of American conservatism, and the early American Republic. He wrote his first book, Tom Paine's America, The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early Republic, in 2011. And co-edited Historian-in-Chief, How Presidents Interpret the Past to Shape the Future, with Willamette's own professor, Richard Ellis. Both books are available on Amazon if you'd like to order. Professor Kotler earned his bachelor's degree from Brown University before obtaining his PhD from Northwestern University. Professor Kotler, thank you so much for joining us today. I will turn it over to you.
All right. Well, mostly I want to take questions from folks. It's always nice to be surrounded by people who are excited about Hamilton, early American history. I'll just tell a brief story about my own sort of experience with the play. So in 2009, I don't know if y'all remember this, but in 2009, Lin-Manuel Miranda went to the White House, I believe it was November, and performed this song that was a hip hop song about Alexander Hamilton. And the world of early American historians just kind of went berserk, right? And the response that everybody had was pretty much like, early American history, hip hop, just no, that's got to be terrible. And B, Alexander Hamilton, like of all the people, why Alexander Hamilton? And so there was tremendous skepticism amongst everybody had heard. And then the video started getting circulated around with this sense of like, okay, I know this is hard to believe, but this is really good. And indeed, it was pretty amazing. And it was such an Obama era play in a host of ways, which I think we can talk about more. And so what happened in the election of 2016 in a weird sort of way, I think ended up really transforming the meaning of the play and the significance of the play in a host of ways that I'm still trying to kind of think through. So anyway, that happened in fall of 2009, and then the play debuts in, I believe it was January of 2015. Again, there was tremendous skepticism about the entirety of the play, and in part because the organization that I spend most of my time with, the professional organization, is called the Society for the Historians of the Early American Republic, which focuses on the years from the American Revolution up through the Civil War. And one of the sort of banes of our existence is what we call founder fetishism, which is, that basically when people want to talk about our era, all they want to talk about is Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, right? All of whom, and James Madison, all of whom are important people, right? And who are worthy of study and important to discuss and understand. But, the other part of it is that we're like, there were lots of other people alive at the time too. Why do we only focus on these few kind of elite political leaders whenever we talk about this era? So that was why some of the skepticism about the play was like, oh, great, another cultural artifact about one of the founding fathers. This really is the last thing that we need. And then it turns out that the play is far more complicated than just that. There was also skepticism because Ron Chernow, who is a good writer and an excellent journalist, and his biography is fine, but there are a lot of historians who have some problems with that biography and the way that it's written, in the sense that it's arguably sort of overly romanticized and overly laudatory of Alexander Hamilton. So anyway, add all those things together. It's the spring of 2016. I've been listening to the soundtrack and really enjoying it. And a friend of mine flies out, who's also an early American historian, who's a very cynical guy. And he has refused to listen to the soundtrack. He's just not interested. He doesn't care about Alexander Hamilton, doesn't want to do it. And I was like, come on, man, like you're a historian of the early American Republic. You have to listen to this. Like we have to do it. So he shows up and we have a 3-hour drive to Tacoma. So we get in the car and he's like, all right, let's do it. Let's listen to it. So I put it on and we didn't talk the entire time. We just sort of listened to it straight. And we arrived to our destination with about 2 songs left. And so I looked over at him and I was like, should I just turn it off? And he's like, no. And so we sat in the parking lot, listened to the last 2 songs. And he was like, I can't believe that guy he used a swear word that I won't repeat. He's like, I can't believe that guy made me care about Alexander Hamilton. That's ridiculous. That's unbelievable. And so this guy was probably the hardest possible audience for this play. And he was completely taken by it. So my sense is that, I, like other historians, most of us, our response to it is like, sure, it's not historically accurate in various ways. There are things that we would want to be different, but it's a brilliant work of art. And it clearly captured the public's imagination in a whole host of ways. And more importantly, it stimulated a whole bunch of curiosity and interest in the area that, I've devoted my life to studying. And so at the time when it first came out, my son was in middle school and we were carpooling and we would frequently listen to it in the car. And there were 2 middle school girls in the back seat. And at one point they started just asking me questions like, well, so what was the difference between the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians? And it was like, for the first time in my life, I was the cool dad because I knew about the politics of the 1790s, which I will tell you is not frequently an experience that people have when they know a lot about the politics of the 1790s. So on the whole, I mean, I'm thrilled that the play came out, that it generated this interest. I taught two classes at Willamette oriented around the play and thinking about the relationship between the play as a work of art and the history that it depicts. And there's a lot of richness there. There's a lot to talk about.
It's common nowadays to have pop cultural portrayals used to make complex material a bit more palatable for enjoyment for the audience. So as a professor, do you feel like that's a good thing because it opens the door for engagement for many other people who otherwise wouldn't? Or is it a bad thing because it oversimplifies the complexities of history?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a double-edged sword. I mean, so for example, the film The Patriot, which is about the American Revolution, is, in my estimation, one of the worst abominations of a film ever made about the American Revolution, and has actually just had a terrible impact on the way people understand what that revolution was and what it meant. So it certainly can be the case that like a cultural artifact can come out and distort the history in a way that's just like super problematic. I don't feel like Hamilton is the equivalent of The Patriot by any means. It's far more subtle and nuanced and sophisticated in terms of how it depicts the people of that era. I mean, that said, I mean, it does play into certain overly simplistic patriotic narratives about the American Revolution that kind of distort that history. So just to pick one example, depicting Alexander Hamilton and John Laurens as abolitionists is accurate, sort of, but also kind of an overstatement. And so it's not to take away from the real work that Laurens did or that Alexander Hamilton did in the New York Manumission Society. It's also been recently revealed that Alexander Hamilton, it seems as if he did actually own slaves at one point in his life. This research just came out recently. Haven't had the chance to sort of pursue it, but it comes from a source that I would trust on that. but more importantly, Alexander Hamilton, as a figure at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, basically agreed to the compromise that allowed slavery to persist and even expand in the years following the Revolution. And there's no evidence that he regretted that or had any second thoughts about that. So that while, in the context of New York, of a city and a state that was putting slavery on a path towards abolition, Alexander Hamilton frequently would serve as an ally to free Black people or to enslaved people who were trying to get their freedom, to individuals. But at a structural level, calling Alexander Hamilton an abolitionist does real violence to the actual history of how abolitionism worked. So that, and then on the second piece, the depiction of the Schuyler sisters as kind of proto-feminists is, really inspirational. And that song, the impact that song has had on young women around the country is phenomenal and is great. And so I don't want to be a naysayer and take that away. And it's an amazing song. But that said, the ideals of what we today would identify as kind of egalitarian modern feminism were not at all what was going on in the minds of the Schuyler sisters at the time. And to the extent that they were, it was because the Schuyler sisters were exceptionally rich and white. And so, those ideas circulating around Mary Wollstonecraft and other early feminists in the 1790s were out there and available, but they were not widely dispersed. And in fact, if anybody was a feminist in the 1790s, it wasn't Alexander Hamilton, it was Aaron Burr.
Is the portrayal of Hamilton and Laurens as abolitionists the most egregious historical error in the play, or what was the wildest exaggeration that you saw in the 3+ hours of the show?
I mean, I guess it's less. My approach to the play has less to do with the kind of fact checking. I hate it when historians do that. It's really annoying, the kind of fact checking. Wow, that was wrong, and more a question of I encourage my students to think critically about why does the play work on them? What buttons is the play pushing, and why do they have those buttons, and why do they work? And so, for example, one of them is around the depiction of the British, of the king as aristocratic and snooty and vaguely effeminate, which is a very old sort of stereotype, right? So there's the manly, rough and rugged Americans, and then there's the kind of snooty, effete, aristocratic British guy. And so the way that the play kind of pushes certain buttons around sort of gender and masculinity in order to get the viewer to, identify with the Americans and not with the British. So one thing I did in my class is that we actually read Samuel Seabury's pamphlet, which if any of you out there in the crowd want to read it, it's on Google Books. You can just Google it and you can read the original. And then we also read Hamilton's pamphlet that was a response to Seabury. And then we had a debate in class. And while the play gets you to think Seabury is just a fool and a moron, and Alexander Hamilton just slays him with his intelligence and his, irrefutable arguments, what happened every time we did this debate was that Samuel Seabury totally kicked Hamilton's butt when the students had to make the argument, which was fascinating to me. And I didn't put my finger on the scales. I didn't do anything to tip it. But when we had the debate, at the end of it, the students ended up in a place, the majority of students ended up in a place where they were like, yeah, I think Seabury's actually got kind of a point. So that's another place where I feel like the play, and of course it doesn't give the loyalist or the Tory view its due. It's a play, right? That's not what it's intended to do. But in terms of the history, all of the uncertainty and kind of sordidness and complexity of the patriot cause and the mobilization for the revolution sort of drops out, and it just becomes, yeah, let's have a drink a toast to freedom, and that's what the revolution becomes about.
Tailing off, the Samuel Seabury and Alexander Hamilton argument, and the larger Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr. Is there any link with the current cultural clash and the current political arguments that sort of link back to the past? Is it, indicia that Americans as a large haven't learned any lessons on how to have political discourse since the 1700s? Or has that evolved? Like, are we just evolved enough that we don't do duels anymore, but if we could, we would? Or what's the story there?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the old cliche that politics is just sort of sublimated violence. And when politics breaks down, that's when violence becomes more likely. And so, yeah, I mean, the polarization that we saw in the 1790s has a similar feel in a host of ways. To give one example, and a lot of the disputes of the 1790s have revolved around the French Revolution and whether one supported it or not. And supporters of the French Revolution would put a cockade in their hat to show their support for the French cause. And then opponents of the French Revolution started putting a black cockade in their hat to show their opposition to the French Revolutionary cause. And which is kind of a parallel a bit to the MAGA hat a little. So, like, for example, if you were wearing the wrong color cockade and walked into the wrong bar, there was a decent chance that you would get beat up. There were a few instances where there were militias, right-wing militias in 1798 who went around beating up newspaper editors they didn't like, one of whom was Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache. So, in the 1790s, there was definitely a lot of, that was also the birth of what was kind of like a QAnon kind of thing, which was the Bavarian Illuminati conspiracy, which had its birth in the US in 1798. And the Illuminati conspiracy was organized around the idea that Thomas Jefferson and the other Democrats were part of a kind of international global cabal that wanted to destroy the nuclear family and churches. And if Thomas Jefferson became elected president, he would immediately burn down all the churches and confiscate everybody's property. Spoiler alert, he did not do that. That is not what happened. But it was a great age of conspiracy theories and political violence and so on. And so, when this play came out in 2015 and 16, that's not where our political culture was, right? It obviously the seeds for such violence and anger and animosity were there because it quickly emerged. And so, it just became so much more heated, right, and contested quickly, sort of over time. And so in that sense, yeah, I mean, it's about an era of our politics. But the other piece about it that I think is important to note is that politics was confined to such a smaller segment of the population at that time, and it was, yeah, and the media, the nature of the media was just so different in that era. So there are lots of ways in which the parallel doesn't entirely work. But in terms of like thinking about, I think another piece of what you were asking had to do with how it maps onto our political divisions today. And that Hamiltonian Jeffersonian divide courses through so much of American history, but in really complex ways. Hamilton was a big believer in the power of the central government and the importance of the federal government. If Hamilton had had his way, he would have abolished the states. He and Madison both advocated for a federal veto of all state laws. That's how much they really hated the states. They thought the states were pretty incompetent. So, in that sense, Hamilton as a conservative doesn't really line up with what a lot of contemporary conservative folks think. On the other hand, Alexander Hamilton hated democracy. He thought democracy was terrible. He thought most people were idiots and didn't know how to, should just stay out of politics. He really didn't believe in equality in a kind of really deep, robust, meaningful way. He was not a particularly idealistic guy around that kind of stuff. And Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, wrote soaring passages about fundamental human equality, had this really kind of utopian vision of, the separation of church and state and free thought and rough economic equality. But he was a real localist who really despised the power of the central government. He was a backward-looking kind of agrarian when it came to economics. And obviously he was a slaveholder, right? And so, we're still living with all of those tensions and those contradictions around race and equality and democracy. But it's hard to just kind of line Jefferson or Hamilton up on one side or the other. It doesn't.
Do you have any idea what their general impression of today's politics would be? Is it the same as it was back then? Different?
Oh man,
any sense of that at all?
So in 1790, the largest city in the United States had about 40,000 people in it. It was about a third the size, or a fourth, 25% the size of Salem was the largest city. And the United States hugged the Atlantic coast about 100 miles in most places. That's why the Northwestern Reserve was in Ohio. That's why Cleveland is the Case Western Reserve. I went to Northwestern, which was considered the Northwest in the 1850s when it was founded. It's just, everything is so unbelievably different. It's hard to kind of transport them from the past and bring them into our present.
Right. Would you consider Hamilton to be pro-immigration, pro-immigrants?
No, actually. So that another thing that happened in 1798 was the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts, so the Alien Act banned, or basically made it harder for people to come to the US and become citizens. And it was mostly targeted at Irish people who tended to come to the US and join the Jeffersonian Democratic Party. And so Hamilton's Federalists really didn't like that. And the Irish were also associated, 1798 is also the year of the Irish Rebellion. And so they associated the Irish with political radicalism. And so Hamilton was a big supporter of the Alien Act, which was a real crackdown on immigration. He also was a big fan of the Sedition Act, which basically put newspaper printers in jail for saying things that were being rude to political authorities. So, that depiction of Hamilton as a kind of plucky, upwardly mobile, pro-immigrant, guy, like the sort of Jay-Z of the 1790s, just doesn't really square. I mean, he was more the type of immigrant who came, made it, and then kicked the ladder out from behind it. That was more the type of immigrant that Alexander Hamilton was.
Do you have any idea if he would be considered a strict constitutionalist, an originalist, or did he go the opposite way and more of a fluid living document?
So, I mean, that in the 1790s, I mean, there was a big debate, right, about the power of the federal government. And Alexander Hamilton almost always erred on the side of it's fine for the federal government to take on new authority and new power. So he was the Secretary of Treasury, and as the Secretary of Treasury, he advocated for the government to play a more kind of direct hand in the finances of the nation. He thought that the federal government should take actions to further economic growth in the country. Hamilton was particularly eager to kind of stimulate the growth of manufacturing and an industrial economy and a more urban economy in the US. part of his rationale for that was that he saw that there were a bunch of women and children who weren't really doing much and were basically just sitting around. And he thought it would be great if we built some factories and put those women and children to work in those factories so they could be productive. So again, not not so great by our 21st century sort of standards of things. So yeah, the federal government itself was so relatively small in that era, right? Between 1790 and 1796, I think it was about 5/6 of the government's expenditures in those years went towards military expenses on the Western frontier, and it went towards displacing Native Americans, right, to clear land in Ohio and then Indiana, so that it would be available for upward mobility for ordinary white men. And Jefferson was a big proponent of that. I mean, Jefferson saw the West as the future of the country. Hamilton and the Federalists tended to be less enthused about that idea of kind of spreading America west. They associated that with with chaos and with kind of ungovernability, and they preferred that landless men stayed and went to work in a factory that they hoped would be built in the U.S.
Now, do we have any vestiges of Alexander Hamilton's influence or view on America's banking system that still exists from today, or over the past 200 years, has it changed so much that it's really, other than the Federal Reserve existing, it's really not the same?
Right. Yeah, it's so radically different that it's hard to say. But I mean he set a really important precedent as the Secretary of Treasury in insisting that the federal government play a real active role in kind of managing the nation's economy. And for him, he saw it as essential for the nation's persistence. Another thing that's really important to remember is that very few people expected this experiment to last. There are all these letters between the founders in the 1790s, like, well, if we're still a country in 5 years, then maybe we'll do this or that. So, we know what happened, but they didn't know what was going to happen. And so there was a real concern. And America was a pipsqueak on the world stage until World War II, really. We now think of the United States as this global hegemon that is the most powerful country in the world. But that's an artifact of the post-World War II era. And so in the late 18th century, the presumption was that, the French or maybe the British or someone will swoop in and basically take over and give us a new king. And that would be that. And so for Hamilton, he thought that, like, in order to survive as a nation, we had to really quickly sort of develop the capacity that Britain had or other countries had to kind of have a national debt, to be able to raise money, to be able to raise an army and a navy to defend ourselves. And Jefferson thought that was terrible. Jefferson associated that with tyranny, and he preferred to just have a nation of farmers spread out across the countryside, and had a more sort of idealistic vision that if we just did our bit and grew our wheat and sold it to Europe, they'd leave us alone and it would all be fine. And Hamilton was a much more kind of hard-headed, realpolitik kind of guy about that stuff.
Is that partly why conservatives sort of cherish Hamilton as one of their foundational thinkers, or what do you think leads to him being held on such a high pedestal by conservative individuals?
I don't fully understand why conservatives hold up, or contemporary conservatives hold up
right.
Hamilton.
Because if he's big on federal power, you would think it'd be the opposite.
Right. Well, and this is where, like, what conservative means is also a moving target, right? And is complicated. So that in the context of the 1790s, where the French Revolution is the main issue, Alexander Hamilton was a real kind of hard-headed realist about the French Revolution, and he thought most of it was just hokum and was dangerous and was silly. Thomas Jefferson would write, rhapsodic statements about how, this is the liberation of mankind from centuries of tyranny and da 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 da. And so in that sense, and the birth of modern conservatism in the Anglo-American context is a book by Edmund Burke, which was published in 1790, The Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was a really critical take on what was happening in France. And so in that sense, that tradition of conservatism was much more in line with Hamilton's thinking, or John Adams or other Federalists, who were very suspicious of these kind of lofty ideals and attempts to kind of translate those lofty ideals into political reality. So in that sense, I think there's good reason to see Hamilton and other Federalists as part of that genealogy of American conservatism. But since, the 1960s or 1970s, American conservatism has become very associated with an anti-statism. And that doesn't square with Hamilton, really. So there's still, so like David Brooks, for example, who writes for the New York Times op-ed page, who identifies as a conservative, he loves Hamilton, and he hates Donald Trump, right? And he sees the modern Republican Party as not at all in line with what David Brooks thinks, and so he advocates for something that's more akin to a kind of Hamiltonian conservatism that sees an important role for the state, but just not in the same way that maybe progressives or liberals see a role for the state.
Shifting more into the personal lives of the characters back then, were Hamilton and President Washington as close as the play makes it seem they were?
So I'm not an expert on the kind of the lives of the founders in that way. So I'm hesitant to kind of pronounce confidently about that. My understanding is yes, that piece of it was pretty clear. Washington rightly identified Hamilton as an incredibly smart and hardworking and ambitious guy, and Washington's prose was incredibly turgid, and he was just not a particularly good communicator. He was an effective leader in a host of ways, but he was just not an effective communicator. And so I think he perceived in Hamilton someone who had just great facility with words. And so, so like a lot of the famous Washington statements, like the farewell address that we associated with George Washington, where actually the bulk of them were written by Alexander Hamilton. And he's voicing things that George Washington thinks and agrees with and believes. But Washington would be like, hey, I need to say something important about this. Hamilton, go write it. So that was pretty.
So even less of a friendship, more of just a tool to a means end.
Yeah, it's hard to really get inside with because their writings are not particularly self-reflective in a kind of modern way. It's not like there's not a whole lot where Washington sat down and unburdened himself about what he really thought about particular people or his relationships with people. So it's hard to get, especially with Washington. It's really hard to get inside the texture of what those personal relationships were like.
Sure. But for the duel with Burr, do you think Hamilton would have become president?
Never going to be president now, right? Isn't that the line in the play? It's never going to be president now.
Other presidents have fought through bigger scandals, I feel.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think Hamilton ever could have been president, and largely because of his anti-democratic disposition. American politics after 1800 really became about your ability to, it's the whole log cabin thing. You had to be born in a log cabin. You had to be one of the guys. And Hamilton had zero interest and zero capacity to do that. One of my favorite moments from Hamilton's political career was in 1795 or 96 around the Jay Treaty. There was a big controversy about the Jay Treaty, and the terms of it were released without the authorization of the president or the government. And it caused a huge uproar on the streets. A lot of people opposed to this treaty. So Hamilton goes up and he stands up on top of a boulder, in front of a building, and he starts explaining to this mob that has gathered to protest the treaty why the treaty is right, and why they need to shut up and go home. And then people just start chucking rocks at his head. And just like, and so basically he has to like duck and run away to avoid getting the crap beat out of him. And his response to that is like, what's wrong with these people? Like, I'm Alexander Hamilton. I understand this stuff. And so, in this sense, I saw someone just post that he wasn't born in the U.S., so he may not have been eligible. But I don't think that applied because he was born. It was before the U.S. was a country. Who knows whether that would have applied or
we
not.
could discuss the constitutionality of Alexander's presidency.
Right.
But we're blue in the
face.
Assuming that he was qualified, it's a no, probably not. He just didn't have the pedigree to win at that time.
Yeah, and that, I mean, his party, the Federalist Party, by 1815 is completely defunct, and that style of more kind of aristocratic, elitist, anti-democratic politics, which worked for Washington, and Adams kind of sort of made it work, even though he wasn't particularly popular. But from that point forward, like that kind of older 18th century Federalist style of leadership was just not something you could win an election with in the US anymore.
Kind of dramatically shifting gears. Was Hamilton romantically involved with Angelica?
I don't know. I feel like I should know that, but I do not.
I mean, the kind of segments reflecting on me. Why do you think Americans are so interested in this sex backstory, whether it's Angelica, Miss Reynolds back at the time? Is it just, the entertainment value of drama, or?
Yeah, well, sex sells and sex scandals sell. It certainly humanizes Hamilton. His foibles become apparent, right? That's the way that the play. This is one criticism historians have made, that there are a lot of ways you could have made Hamilton seem less perfect. Like, for example, emphasizing the fact that he hated democracy or other things. But that's not what Lin-Manuel Miranda chose, right? He chose his infidelity to do that. And that's true. It's a true story, around the Reynolds pamphlet and so on. But it's, this is the area where I think most historians are like, look, it's a play. And this is a character that he wants the audience to kind of feel an investment in. And the audience cares about Eliza, and the audience cares about Alexander Hamilton, and they care about that relationship. And so, here is the Maria Reynolds story. How could you not bring that into the play? How could you not incorporate that as a pretty standard trope in a play about an individual? So in that sense, it's fairly accurate, and it works well to kind of capture his personality.
In the play, Aaron Burr plays this narrator, pseudo antagonist. Is that kind of his role in real life? Did people dislike Aaron Burr as much as Lin-Manuel wanted you to dislike Burr in the play? Or is it just another politician? It was a 50-50 split.
Right. Burr is such a complicated character, and there are he has his defenders. There are plenty of people out there who think Aaron Burr has really gotten the short end of the stick, and this play just continues that sort of unfairness. I'm less of an expert on Burr, so I don't have a really strong, forceful opinion about him. I mean, I do know that, I think I mentioned this before, that, Aaron Burr read Mary Wollstonecraft in the 1790s, and he and his wife had this really amazing kind of intellectual relationship, and he raised his daughter to be a really, like, by the standards of the time, an incredibly liberated, sort of self-confident woman. And there's zero evidence that Alexander Hamilton ever gave a tiny bit about what the feminism of the 18th century. So in that sense, Aaron Burr, in a cultural sense, is much more kind of interesting and cutting edge and revolutionary than Alexander Hamilton was. And so, framing Hamilton as the principled guy, I think is true, that he had a kind of sense of personal integrity that was genuine.
Aaron Burr was also apathetic or wishy-washy just to get, going with the political winds for his own benefit, as the play portrays him.
Right. So, or that Burr was a bit more like that. So Burr was a bit more like that. Hamilton, but the thing about Hamilton and his principles is that the principles that Hamilton stood for, if you were to really dig into them in the context of the 21st century, most people in the 21st century would not find them particularly relevant or appealing or admirable. Whereas the things that Burr articulated and expressed in his life are probably a bit more congruent with what 21st century folks think. But in terms of their personal sense of integrity, Hamilton probably comes out ahead in that, because Burr really was kind of an opportunist in a host of ways.
We're getting a lot of interesting questions about some of the other characters involved. So I guess my first question is, of the Laurens, Lafayette, Hercules, Mulligan, some of those secondary and tertiary characters, were any of them slave owners?
So Lafayette became an abolitionist, though again, it's an 18th century and early 19th century version of this. So oftentimes this would involve, buying a plantation in the Caribbean and freeing the enslaved people there, but then insisting that they stay on as free laborers, working in pretty crappy conditions, but getting paid, so they weren't slaves anymore. So maybe the distinction would be between being a more radical abolitionist and being someone who thought slavery was wrong. And Lafayette, in the context of in 18th century Paris, where Jefferson had spent some time, in the intellectual circles of Paris at the time, it was just taken as a given that slavery is wrong, and that slavery is a vestigial institution that should go away in the Age of Enlightenment. Then the question became okay, so what are you going to sacrifice to make that actually happen? And once you end slavery, how willing are you to think of formerly enslaved people as equal citizens of the polity that then exists? And that was the place where folks tended to be less radical on their abolitionism. And the other piece to remember in the context of the revolution is that the cotton gin is invented in 1793, which is a really crucial moment, so that many people, especially in places like Virginia and Maryland, who were slaveholders, slavery was becoming more economically unviable and unproductive. And so it wasn't unreasonable for some people to think that maybe slavery would just kind of fade away and vanish as a viable economic system, which was really wishful thinking. And the people in South Carolina certainly did not want that to be the case and were very committed to slavery as an institution. But the cotton economy that became dominant in the 19th century and explains why slavery spreads across the Southeast and into Texas over the course of a couple generations, that cotton boom was not something that anyone in 1787 predicted or could have known was happening. So I say that not to excuse their inaction on slavery in 1787, but just to kind of give the context of what we know what eventually will happen, which is that cotton will just become this immensely profitable crop that will just lead to this massive expansion of slavery as a labor system across the Southeast and into the Southwest. But there were a lot of people just kind of hoping and wishing that wouldn't happen, and they were wrong. And they built a political system that was capable of accommodating that expansion of slavery across the South. So anyway, so Lafayette, Laurens is an interesting character. I mean, he dies in 1783. So we don't know what would have become of him. But he did propose a pretty radical proposal to South Carolina, that they arm a group of 3,000 slaves and give them their freedom after fighting for the cause. It was, summarily rejected. I mean, most of the people, and Lawrence himself came from one of the wealthiest slave trading families in Charleston, South Carolina. His father, Henry Lawrence, was one of the wealthiest men in Charleston, and he made all of his money out of the slave trade. So, so John Lawrence was a man entirely made out of slaves in terms of his wealth and his upbringing. But to his credit, John Lawrence came to think that institution that had made him the person he was should no longer persist.
Sure. Now, were Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence romantically involved, to your knowledge?
There's if you want to read about, there's a guy named Thomas Foster, a historian named Thomas Foster, who has written about this. And so, look that up and see. It's been a while since I read it, and so I'm hesitant to summarize his conclusions. But I think it's inconclusive, is my understanding.
In the reading you circulated, it expressed the idea that by casting white historical figures with people of color, it erases the stories of the actual people of color back in the 1700s. Can you elaborate on some of the stories that we may not know of that should have been included in the play? I think Cato was the one name that was discussed in that article. So maybe start from there, and any other individuals that piqued your interest that are worthy of sharing.
Right. Yeah. So one figure, there's a lot of great works on a figure named Henry Washington, who was enslaved on George Washington's plantation. And Henry Washington fled that plantation during the Revolution and ended up in Sierra Leone, and was a kind of founding father of sorts of the country of Sierra Leone in Northern Africa. And all of the founding fathers had multiple people who they enslaved, who freed themselves during the course of the American Revolution. I was taking a tour of Mount Vernon with a group of, I was a chaperone with a group of middle school students. And I did my best to keep my mouth shut and not be the obnoxious, dad who was a historian. But there was one moment when we were standing on the lawn. If you've ever been to Mount Vernon, the house overlooks the Potomac River, and there's a beautiful lawn that stretches down. The house is up on a hill looking over the Potomac River. And one of the missed opportunities, in my opinion, at Mount Vernon, a misinterpretive opportunity, is that we know that early on in the American Revolution, a British ship, a ship of war, sailed up the Potomac, and several of George Washington's slaves saw the ship and just took off running down to the river. They got on the ship and they fled. And for many of them, we don't know what came of them. But when we think about what freedom meant in the context of the 18th century, for a lot of the founders, especially in places like Virginia and South Carolina, freedom to them meant the freedom to become economically wealthy with the use of slave labor. And that contradiction was just built into the foundation of the nation in a host of ways. But it doesn't mean that enslaved people willingly participated in that bargain, right? That there was a ton of resistance, and people took the opportunity of the kind of chaos and uncertainty of the revolution to try to, as best as they could, make decisions to gain their own freedom. And so Henry Washington is an example of that. In many of the northern states, there were significant numbers of enslaved African Americans who, so like, for example, in Massachusetts, people would petition the legislature and they would say, well, look, you just said that all men are created equal, so I shouldn't be a slave. Like, on what basis can I be held as a slave? And then ultimately, those suits succeeded, and Massachusetts abolished slavery. And in part, it was led by, from the top, by sort of well-meaning, well-intentioned kind of leaders. But a lot of it was also provoked by the actions of enslaved people themselves, who pushed back against that institution, sort of saw those stated ideals that the revolution was supposed to be about, and kind of forced the hand of political leaders to kind of live up to those ideals. So anyway, I mean, in thinking about, and another detail about the role of kind of African Americans in the American Revolution is that roughly in a proportion of 3-1, when Black people fought in the Revolution, they fought on the side of the British, not on the side of the Patriots. And so frequently, when people were making their decision about who to side with, they thought the British were more likely to be a path towards freedom than siding with the Patriots.
Now, have you seen you mentioned earlier in your class that you saw the original film version. Have you seen the Disney version since then?
I have not seen the Disney version. I saw the play in person in New York in the summer of 2016.
What was the difference in the two by seeing it on screen and seeing it in person? What were the biggest differences that you felt?
Gosh. There is something about seeing it with an audience of people. The play, it's a very patriotic play, like part of there's the kind of joy that comes with like jeering at that awful British king, and sort of sitting in a group of people and, taking pleasure in the king getting his comeuppance. So that I think in a way that it pushes more of those nationalistic or patriotic buttons when you're in a big crowd of people than when you're just sitting in your TV room watching it on a screen.
Sure. In one scene, Aaron Burr goes off about all of the writings that Alexander Hamilton did. Now, I guess my question is, were they all unique writings, or was he just someone that wasn't very succinct and wrote kind of similar ideas over and over to try and gain as much interest from different perspectives as possible?
Well, he was certainly prolific, that's for sure. I don't know if I'd describe him as a particularly original thinker, but he was an effective advocate for his case. The Federalist Papers, which is mostly him and Madison, and overwhelmingly him. It's propaganda, but it's very effective propaganda. It's a really and most of those were written, on the spot. Because they were written for the newspaper. They were published serially in the newspaper, almost entirely in New York, and they were intended to sway the Constitutional Convention in New York to vote to ratify. And so, it'd be like, oh, we need something on this. And so Hamilton would sit down and he would write it out, and, it would be going into the newspaper the next day, and he would be finishing the last paragraph as they were setting the type to make the newspaper for the next day. So, when you think of these as basically first drafts, like most of the Federalist Papers were first drafts, that's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive.
Throughout the play, there are also overtures of Lafayette and Hamilton sort of having parallel thought processes. So their tactical brilliance is the same. They're both immigrants. Did Lafayette have a lot of influence over Hamilton's thinking? Did Hamilton borrow / steal a lot of Lafayette's ideas and repackage them as their own? Or is that just overplayed in the play as well?
Yeah, I haven't done a lot of thinking about the relationship between Hamilton and Lafayette. Usually Lafayette is understood as kind of the understudy to Washington, the beloved son that Washington never had. Because Lafayette was very young.
Kind of play that as Hamilton in the play, but It's really Lafayette who has that connection with. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I would say more so than Hamilton. And Lafayette is, I can't remember exactly how old he is, but I think he's in his late teens during the Revolution. So he's a pretty young man. And so his political ideas are not super well formed. And Lafayette was never a kind of towering genius of political philosophy necessarily. I mean, he was an effective leader. So yeah, I don't know that there's a lot of, or not that much that I know about in terms of that influence.
With Hamilton, Jefferson, and Burr, how do you think they would handle our current fake news situation that we have going on in America? Would some of them sympathize more with fake news to get ahead? How do you think that would unravel if those three were here today?
I mean, so I spent a lot of time reading the newspapers of the 1790s, and they're filled with all kinds of fake news. And in part because it was harder to know what was really happening. The telegraph is still 50 years away. And so, when you're writing a newspaper article about some battle in France that happened a month ago that you're getting competing reports about, the capacity to kind of strive for veracity and accuracy was just very different at the time. But certainly Jefferson and Madison understood the importance of effective political communication. Jefferson was the object of many smears at the time, some of which were based on accurate things, others were not. So yeah, we shouldn't imagine the era of the 1790s as this moment of great, veracity and integrity when it came to what people were putting in the newspaper.
Okay. So would you say that their political thoughts were more influenced by, the realpolitik and their self-interest, or did some of them actually have more a classical influence of political beliefs from Greece, Rome, and other prior nation-state empires?
I mean, Madison was a total nerd. That was, when he was preparing to go to the Constitutional Convention, he sat down and he made it a plan for himself to read about every form of government ever in the world. Just a small project that he set for himself, and he did it. And so, Madison was very self-conscious and intentional about his study of political history and that kind of thing. I mean, he did it in a way that we today wouldn't necessarily see as rigorous or a good methodology, but it was the methodology that in the 18th century was understood to be how one does this. And I think, Jefferson, I think his idealism was genuine, and I think his powers of self-deception were also monumental, and his ability to kind of not square various contradictions in his life. But I think that the idea that, to me, that is really compelling from that 18th century moment that many of that founding generation believed in was the importance of education and civic virtue. I think they sort of hoped that, a nation comprised of citizens, and at that point they only thought of citizens as men, white men, and for the most part, white men who owned property. But if we take that as the kernel of an idea and extend that more broadly to be more inclusive in the way we understand citizenship today, that they thought it was hugely important that citizens have the capacity to know what's going on and to think clearly about it, and to make arguments based upon facts and evidence. And they were men of the Enlightenment in that sense. And John Adams and the Federalists tended to be more cynical about that, and basically felt like, oh, come on, people are never going to be like that. Most people aren't like that. That's never going to happen. But the Jeffersonians tended to be more sort of utopian and idealistic about it. And just, for me, I tend to side on their side of it, right? With the hope that, for democracy to persist. Adams and Hamilton didn't really care that much about democracy. So to them, it wasn't as important. But to the people who really did care more about sort of equality and democracy as values, they thought that it was really important that just ordinary citizens be educated and have access to reliable information so that they could participate politics in a more informed way.
Were there any specific individuals or events from the Revolution that you thought should have been included in the musical?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, in some ways, I think so. That the article that I circulated to folks by Lyra Montero, one of the implications that I take from that is that it was sort of a missed opportunity to write a play about the founding era that centered someone other than the usual suspects. Right? And so, just to give one example, there's a great, if folks are interested in reading a really good history book, there's a book by a historian named Erica Dunbar, and it's called Never Caught, and it's the story of Ona Judge, who was a young woman who was owned by George and Martha Washington. And in 1793, she fled. She escaped when she was living in Philadelphia with the Washington family, and was never caught, and lived as a free woman until the 1840s in New Hampshire. And it's the story of how George Washington tried to get her back and used all kinds of underhanded, dirty tricks to try to get her back into slavery. But this woman with, no formal education, a Black woman in 18th century and early 19th century America with very few resources was able to evade the clutches of the most powerful man in America and hold on to her freedom and remain free. And it's an incredibly dramatic story, and so why do we need another play about Alexander Hamilton when we could have a play about Ona Judge, or we could have a play about Henry Washington, or there are multiple kind of characters from that era who we today would be able to identify with and see as kind of heroes of that revolutionary era. In a way that might feel more politically relevant in the 21st century. So I think what Montero in some ways is sort of criticizing Lin-Manuel Miranda for, and it's far be it from me to criticize him for the choices that he made, but there was something kind of like easy and it's kind of low-hanging fruit to write a hip hop play about a founding father, because it seems cheeky and Alexander Hamilton in hip hop, what? And then people will watch it because they know who Hamilton is and they recognize who Hamilton is. But it would have been a riskier and a more kind of radical choice to pick someone else, pick another character from the 18th century and really bring them to life and enable us to kind of see that era through a different kind of lens. Because the basic narrative of the play in terms of politics is a pretty conventional, conservative, traditional one that really evades and erases a lot of the issues that I think most historians would think are like really central and important to that era.
We have two Willamette sweethearts who are watching right now, who are expecting a child literally any minute. And they're considering
Eliza,
Hamilton-inspired name for their child. Are there any that they need to avoid at all costs? That's just a no-go. It's going to embarrass this kid years down the line.
Yeah.
And conversely, are there some that you would suggest are pretty safe? Historical context-wise, not necessarily the.
I don't feel like there are any, of the kind of main characters in the play. I don't feel like there are any who are just. It would be terrible to be saddled with such a name in the future.
So Hercules Mulligan is a clear go.
That's gutsy, to kind of, but so that said, I should say that, so I was born in 1968, which is a year before Sesame Street started. And my dad wanted to name me Kermit. And my grandmother, bless her soul, was like, you may not name my grandson Kermit. No, absolutely not. So I was not named Kermit. I was named Seth, and then a year later, Kermit the Frog entered into the world as a character, and so I totally dodged a bullet on that one. I could have been getting "it's not easy being green" jokes for my entire life.
Right. Well, we've gone over a little bit, but I do have a few more questions that are a bit lighter, not as in depth, and personal to you. So first off, what's your favorite Hamilton song?
Oh, "I'll Be Back" is just I love that song, but and the attitude of the actor who plays it, and the way they embody, and the way that they do that Britpop thing, like that kind of 60s, 70s Britpop thing. It's just it's perfect.
No, it's very, very catchy and well done.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Do you view yourself as more, and this is play specific, what we could do too, play specific and then in real life. Do you view yourself more as a Hamilton or as a Burr?
Well, in terms of the play, definitely Hamilton. I mean, that would be telling on oneself in a terrible way to be more Burr when it comes to the play. And then, gosh, in real life, man, I don't know. So my first book was all about basically telling the story of the 1790s from the perspective of Thomas Paine and the people who admired him in the 1790s. And all of those people just absolutely hated Alexander Hamilton and everything that he stood for. So I spent so many years of my life kind of feeling obligated to dislike Alexander Hamilton that it's hard for me to say that. But on the other hand, I don't have any great love for Aaron Burr either.
All right, last question, and you and I talked about this before we went live, and I'll have you know, 2 other people asked the same question, so I feel a little vindicated with this question. But at the end of the show, Eliza steps to the front of the stage. She's enveloped in the spotlight. She sees the audience and dramatically gasps. And I'd like to know, and others as well, what was your interpretation of that moment?
I think one of the reasons why historians love this play is because it's so self-aware about history and memory. Like the song about the burning the letters, and who tells your story. I mean, that's what historians do. We tell the stories of dead people, and we read their mail, and we get really sad when people burn their mail. And so that last scene, I think, to me, is a moment of that kind of meta self-awareness in the play, where the play is she's drawing attention to the playness of the play, that it is a play, much like the play draws attention to the act of remembering and telling the stories of people in the past while it's telling the stories about people in the past. So that's how I would choose to read.
Wonderful, thank you. With that, thank you so much, Professor Kotler, for joining us this afternoon. It was great. We appreciate your insights, your knowledge, the historical perspective of what has become a pop culture icon for all of us. For everyone out there, if you enjoyed this discussion and would like to see more webinars, as well as other exciting Willamette content, continue to tune into WooStream, our virtual programming platform. Thank you so much for joining us. You all have a wonderful night, and hope to see you all soon.